Ready?
So,
go. Hi everyone, I'm Jess. I'm the Director of Adult Services at the downtown location.
and I'm Seth. I'm working the multimedia and fiction department.
And we're going to talk to you today about refinishing furniture. We have here, what is this, Seth?
This is a Hoosier cabinet from the early 20th century that I just acquired recently. It's in need of some repair and also some refurnishing, so that's what we're going to do today.
And there's also a top half to this?
Yes, there's also a top half to this, so this is actually only the bottom half. So instead of trying to do the whole project, we're going to just do the first half and see how it turns out for us today.
So we'll do a couple of different segments, and we'll start out with how to actually strip your furniture, because a lot of furniture has multiple layers of paint, polyurethane, stain, dirt, all of that stuff on it.
All that good stuff.
All that good stuff, just like this has all that good stuff on it. We want to remove that without damaging the wood, which is what sanding would do. Sometimes you have to sand, but if you can avoid compromising the integrity of the wood itself, that's the best way to go about things, especially if you're planning to stain it. So we have 3 cabinets here. This first, or not 3 cabinets, 3 drawers on the cabinet. This first one hasn't had anything done to it yet. The second one we've already stripped, so we can show you how to do some repairs. And the third one has been stripped as well and has already been repaired, so we can show you how to paint, which is what Seth and his wife are going to do to this thing. So, before we get started, we'll talk about the things that you'll need in order to strip. So, first things first, safety is the most important.
Safety goggles.
Seth has his goggles on. You're also wearing a long sleeve shirt, which is also very important. I'm not wearing one because I'll be standing over here the whole time for safety's sake. And also because it's warm out. But in addition to those, we have our very important gloves. And if you want to show everyone those, it's important to have not just gloves. Do not go and get your rubber gloves from the kitchen. That's a very bad idea because those are not thick enough. These are actually rated specifically for chemical use. They're chemical gloves that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot. All this stuff you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot or even at Walmart. So you won't have to spend a lot of money. Most of this stuff is really inexpensive. So once you've got all of your safety precautions in place, you want to do all of this outdoors in a well-ventilated area, just like we are. You also want to put down some plastic or tarp, or even like used feed bags if you have some of those laying around, just to protect the surface that's underneath. We also have our stripper. What we have here is an old can of zip strip because I had some of that at home, but any sort of stripper that you can find at Lowe's or Home Depot is going to work. We have here grade-free steel wool, and I'll explain why we have that in a little bit. We've got a couple of different scrubbing brushes that have smaller heads that I'll show you more specifically, but Seth, if you want to hold them up.
Some of the few brushes.
These guys.
And we also have this paint scraper.
So we'll go ahead and get started. We'll do the first step, which is stripping a piece of wood.
So this is my first time refinishing any furniture before, so Jess is going to help me learn how to do this today.
So the first thing that we want to do when we refinish furniture is actually remove anything that's attached that we don't want to refinish. So that means handles, any sort of knobs. If you have hooks or screws that are unnecessary, you want to go ahead and remove them first. So we're going to do that with the handle of this drawer. So that's got a flat head. You might need a Phillips head screwdriver. It's always good to have a toolkit at home anyway, no matter what, but it'll come especially in handy here. The other tool that we use in particular with this is usually a pair of vice grips. And if you're reupholstering something, you'll use vice grips a lot to rip out any old screws, or not screws, but really upholstery nails or tacks, as well as staples that are used to hold the fabric in place. So it looks like we're starting to get, these handles are pretty old, kind of vintage looking. I will take that.
Thank you.
We don't have any chemicals yet, so it's safe for me to put my hands over here.
I'm going to take this glove off real quick just so I can unscrew this screw, and then I'll put it back on once we start dealing with the chemicals.
There we go. So a good idea, if you've got handles and screws and you're not sure where to put them or how to make sure that you don't lose track of them, just take a piece of painter's tape and tape them to each other. That's essentially the best thing to do. At least if you lose them both, they're together. So if you find them again,
which I'm
then
prone
they're
to
still
do.
together. Yeah, we're both prone
lose
to losing
things, so.
stuff, so that's going to happen. All right, so we've got, this is kind of stripped of any metal that we're not going to be refinishing, so it's actually time to start removing the stained polyurethane, whatever you may have on your wooden surface. So we're going to start with our stripper. Pop it in a jar. It's very important when you're doing this. I would not recommend just dipping a brush directly into any of this stuff, any of these strippers that you're going to use. We have a more less chemically unfriendly stripper, I guess we'll say, in this jug right here. This is Citrus Strip. It takes a little bit longer, so we're not using it today just for expedition. But with this stuff, you want to do the exact same thing that you're doing with your zip strip, mineral spirits, anything like that, because you don't want to leave it in its original container, because if you're dipping in and recharging your brush each time, and it has gunk on it from when you were last brushing on here, you're actually kind of diluting what's inside. The other important thing to note about whatever you're going to put your stripper in, make sure it is not an inorganic material. Do not use plastic, do not use anything really that can dissolve, essentially, because this stuff is pretty strong and it's basically used to
strip stuff, take stuff away.
And essentially burn stuff away. So you want to use glass.
Which is another reason why we're in a ventilated area today, because the fumes can also be dangerous if you're not wearing any kind of protection, so you need to be outside.
Use glass, use aluminum, you can use a clay vessel if you want to, or even a wooden vessel. It's not going to damage any of the original wood. So once you've poured out a good bit of it, just make sure that you re-lid your stripper after you're done so you don't spill any of it out. So you can just use any sort of brush with natural hair bristles. You don't want to use anything with synthetic bristles because, again, it's going to burn through the synthetic plastic. So once you've got your paintbrush, your stripper, it's kind of the same concept as painting. You just want to layer it on sort of thick. With stripping, though, the important thing to remember is that don't do the entire surface. Do not do this entire drawer. Don't do anything that's massive. I would recommend, at least as you start out and as you're figuring out what to do, use a space on the wood that's about the size of your fist. And I would recommend, if you haven't tried your stripper before and you're brand new to this, using an area that isn't going to be seen, especially if you're planning to refinish your furniture with stain, because you don't want to end up, it's kind of like hair dye, right? You don't want to like dye a section of your hair and it all falls out. Like, you just want to test to make sure that you're not overdoing it or using a stripper that's too abrasive. So Seth is doing roughly like a 4-inch patch, and he's layering on the stripper pretty thick, which is exactly what you want to do. The thicker it is, the better it's going to penetrate through whatever stripper or sealant that you have on the wood. The goal is to see bubbling and kind of loosening. Essentially, that means that the stripper is getting underneath any of the stain or the paint or the sealant that you've got on there. And the more bubbles that you see, the better a sign it is that it's actually permeating that layer. This cabinet doesn't have a ton of anything on it. My guess would be, I think our best guess is that it's just polyurethane. It was just a sealant that was placed on the wood to protect it. But it's so old that the sealant is starting to crack in some places. Through extensive use over time, it's starting to fade in certain spots. There's kind of an uneven patina, which you'll see roughly around the handle area. You'll see more use of the wood as opposed to like the front of the cabinet, which doesn't have that much like patina from it. Essentially, that's your aging of your wood over time. The thing about stripping versus staining is, or stripping versus sanding really, is that stripping the wood ensures that you don't lose any of that patina, and I'll go over that a little bit more. You'll kind of see what that looks like when we're working on a repair piece, but you want to try and avoid losing that because that's part of the wood and how it ages and how it looks. If you want it to look brand new, you can sand it. I will say sanding also takes way longer. It takes forever to do, and it takes me back to 8th grade wood shop and Mr. Mazaka, like being like, you have to sand this for hours.
And if you don't have an electric sander, you're doing it by hand, and that
Exactly.
takes a lot of grunt work.
Right, and the other thing about sanding is that when you have to get like a certain spot, like let's say on the edging, if there's any detail or a gap or a hole or any sort of decorative aspect to the wood that you're working with, it's going to take so much longer to sand and so much longer to get all of that paint or all of that stain off of there. This kind of cuts to the core and really slices right through everything, removes it pretty quickly, and the hardest part that you're going to have probably is just prep work, really, and you saw that it wasn't all that hard.
After we left it on there for a little bit, you can already see kind of how it's acting, and that's also in part due to the strength of the removing that we have. So it's about time for me to strip it.
Of this part, because this is my favorite part.
So now that it's gotten to that point, I can go ahead and take a paint scraper. I can go ahead and start kind of removing it, and you'll already be able to see kind of how the color of the wood changes and how it's what it's removing, the residue and the dirt and the gunk. And the sealant, I should say.
And what you can see too, if you're scraping off, and
we want to scrape off into a bag as well.
That's right. If you're removing any of your stain sealant, whatever, you're going to want to remove it using a similarly organic material, just like with your little glass jar that you're pouring the sealant or the stripper into. Because you don't want, again, to burn through whatever you're using. If you use a plastic bag, it's going to cut right through that, and then you'll have like a pile of glop on a burning plastic bag, essentially.
Which is never good.
That's not good. We don't want that. So make sure that you use a paper bag, or even, again, a wooden box if you're using that for any sort of chemical disposal, or even like something like an empty paint can that's been cleaned out really well. So what we can see here.
Is there a certain way I need to scrape off the sealant, Jeff?
One of the best things to do when you're scraping off sealant is to start by going with the grain. You can always go with the grain. That's probably the safest way to do things, especially if you're using one of these brushes. And I think we're about ready for steel wool here. I'm going to take a little video of this part. If you want to start scraping it with some steel wool. The next step is going to be using steel wool in order to kind of scrub away any of the excess stripper that's still left on there. You're not going to be able to immediately just like scrape off everything. I've had that experience maybe once, and I've done close to a dozen pieces. So you're going to have to scrub off.
And that's when we want to be going with the grain.
Right, exactly. You don't want to go against the grain at all if you can avoid it. There are some cases where it is unavoidable, for example, where two pieces of wood butt up against each other. But the more you can avoid it, the less likely you are to scrape your wood and leave kind of damaging impact. It's almost like sanding against the grain. You don't want to do that. You don't want to damage it that way, especially for stuff that's facing out. Seth is using grade 3 steel wool. Steel wool comes in grades from 4 all the way down to quadruple 0. 4 is the coarsest kind of steel wool that you can get. It's basically, I don't even know what to compare it to. It's extremely scratchy. It's like a giant, it is steel wool, and it's kind of like taking a giant sheep and just rubbing it all over yourself, but it's also metal. So for really, really thick, like coatings of paint or stain or something that is really like grudge worthy, you'd want to use grade 4. Seth's using grade 3 here, which is a good all-purpose kind of coarse steel wool to kind of scrub and remove. And when we get to the point of repair and cleaning, I'll show you what the other level of steel wool that we use, which is either 00 or 000. 4 is the coarsest, quadruple 0 is the finest or softest. So we don't want to start off with real soft steel wool because it's just not going to be abrasive enough to scrape everything off. Whereas we don't want to use 3 later on because it's not going to do that fine detail work to really clean out the grain and remove any gunk before we paint or stain. Look at that.
You can already see that big difference between these two colors right here.
Absolutely. And you can see there's open grain here as well. Another thing to look for when you're stripping is if your grain is open, which means that you can kind of see little striations and lines, you want to try and clean that out as best as you can, which is why we have these brushes here. They're usually sold in a pack of 3, and they come in 3 different levels of strength, essentially. The plastic one that we have here, plastic is a good kind of just scrubber, especially if you have soft wood or if you're trying to strip a piece of metal, which you can also do, or strip a piece of glass and you don't want to scratch it. Plastic is a good one. The next level up is brass, which Seth is holding here. Brass is a good kind of all-purpose grain cleaner and like tricky spots. So if you're doing a chair and the entire back of it is spindled, you'll be able to use one of these pretty well in order to scrub away everything that you can't use steel wool for. This is more for detail work. And the strongest one that we've got here is actually steel wool as a brush. It's stainless steel. This you want to use as sparingly as possible for the really tough stuff, the really tricky corners, that one spot of paint that just won't go away. This is basically like using steel wool in a brush, so it's going to be very, very strong. If you start scrubbing too hard, it basically acts as sandpaper, and it's going to start removing the patina of the wood. So if you want to try and avoid that, use this as sparingly as you can. Try to lean on your brass brush, but know that this is here for when you've got a really tricky spot. So I think this is looking good. We'll go ahead and get it finished, and then we'll start talking about repair. All right, now we're going to talk about repairing and cleaning and prepping your piece for painting or staining. So we've got here one of our cabinet drawers, which has been stripped and it's ready to go. You'll definitely want to take one of these beautiful, it's usually not this sturdy, but a rag that's just been wet with water and kind of wipe down anything that you've got dusty or, you know, just like dirt marks or anything like that, just to clean everything off. After you've stripped and before you paint or refinish, you're going to want to repair any wobbling, wiggling, loose brackets, loose nails, loose screws, anything like that. The biggest thing, loose nails, loose screws, you know how to handle that. You'll just tap them back in, screw them back in, whatever. Same thing with loose brackets. You can reinforce those by new brackets to support the ones that are already in place. The biggest thing though is if you have a wobbling or kind of pivoting or wiggling or bending drawer, chair, anything like that. The best thing to do is to wrap a piece of rope around it, tie it tight, but before you do that, take cardboard sleeves and put them around the corners. Before you tie it tightly, take wood glue to reinforce any sort of looseness that there may be. If you've got 2 pieces that are starting to come apart, tuck wood glue in there. You can use a toothpick or even a safety pin if that's what's going to get it down into the crevice. Kind of tighten it into place and then use a piece of rope wrapped around it or a C-clamp in order to lock it in place. Just make sure that whatever you're using, you take a piece of cardboard and put it between the wood and the tool. Otherwise, you're likely to damage the wood. You don't want to leave any markings from the clamp or from the rope. The other important thing to do is fill any holes that you might have in the wood, any scratches, dents, anything like that. So you're just going to want to use wood putty or wood filler. Mine has a purple lid because it starts out purple and then when it's white it's dry. Pretty smart stuff.
Cool.
Science these days. It's incredible. It's very easy to use. Most wood fillers, the big difference between this and something like a putty for the wall for filling holes is that this is going to dry natural and it sands to the same consistency that wood does. So if you have like a glob of it that you've put on a hole, I mean, I try to avoid that, but if you do, or even if you just have some rough edges, you'll be able to sand it down lightly and smoothly. Use maybe like, I would say maybe like a 120 or a 130 grit sandpaper to kind of smooth it out, and then maybe a 240 to get it really fine.
And what is the difference between wood glue and wood putty, Jess?
So with wood putty, putty is filled specifically for filling, or putty or filler is basically the same thing. This will be used for filling holes. Wood glue is an adhesive that seals 2 pieces of wood together. Wood glue, if any of you have used it, it's super strong and it binds pretty quickly, but it also is clear and it is not responsive to sanding. So you definitely don't want to put a glob of wood glue on here to cover up a hole, because then you're going to just have a mound of plastic essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, and you want to avoid that. So use this for any surface of your project that people are going to see. Use wood glue in the spaces that people aren't going to see to reinforce it and make it stronger.
Okay.
Once you've repaired any pieces of furniture that need help or support or additional strengthening, the next step before we paint or we refinish is to clean. So what we're going to do, we've got our second piece of steel wool here. This is grade quadruple 0. It's extremely soft. What does it feel like?
It feels like a very, very fine wool.
Yep. It's just
basically
pretty much what it is.
My best definition of it.
Right, it's extremely soft, and what this does is it essentially buffs out any sort of things or little kernels of older steel wool, little kernels of stripper that might be left behind, anything like that. So we're just going to give it a good rub down. This is so soft that it's not going to act as any sort of sanding process. It's so soft that really you can rub it against. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can rub it against your skin. It's not really very painful. And as you can see, Seth doesn't have his gloves on here because it's not necessary at this point. All of the stripper's gone, everything is dry, so we're good to go. Once you have that done, your next step is going to be, or your final step really before you paint, is going to be to take cheesecloth or tack cloth, which you can also find Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, anything like that. Looks like this. It's very sticky, it's very tacky, which is why it's called tack cloth. But you're essentially just going to wipe down any surface that you're planning to paint that's going to catch any leftover fibers from your steel wool, any dust that's in the air, any of those little kernels that were left behind, cat hair, rabbit hair, anything like that. Human hair also. It's going to catch any of that stuff that's left behind, even fibers from your clothing, because you don't want any of that to be on this piece of wood when we go to paint, and especially when we go to stain and seal.
Take two.
Take two. So now we're going to talk about painting. This is probably the easiest part of the process. Seth has here some chalk paint. A beautiful robin's egg blue.
Oh, yeah.
He's got his stir stick. It's pretty essential to have one of those. You don't want your paint to separate, and if you've ever encountered any type of paint before, acrylic, nail polish, wall paint, anything like that, it starts to separate really quickly. So make sure it's really well stirred together and really well blended before you start painting. Especially if you have an oil-based paint, if you just dip your brush in there and get it covered with oil and then slather it onto your wood, you'll need to rewind to the beginning of our video and start again.
We don't want to do that, so
we don't want to do that.
Make sure we stir it real
yes.
good.
So we've got, what size brush is that?
This is going to be a 2-inch brush.
2-inch brush, perfect.
For the bigger areas of the cabinet, we would use a bigger brush, but because this is just a drawer, it's a lot easier just to use a smaller brush for this area.
Make sure too that you have a smaller brush as well for those detail areas if you're getting into nooks or crannies or corners or anything like that. This way, this is kind of like the all-purpose brush, but when you have a detailed spot, you need a detailed brush. So I think we'll go ahead and paint.
Go ahead and get started.
When you're applying your paint, especially your first coat, you just want to make sure that you go with the grain. Kind of like when you're painting your nails, you want to go this way. Don't be weird and go this way instead. That would be strange. But it's also a little bit easier to go with the grain as opposed to against it. It'll also help to fill those open sections of grain that we stripped out before. We got rid of all of that gunk that was in there. It's almost like filling a tooth in a way. We got rid of the cavity, we hollowed it out and got it clean, but now we need to fill it up with something new and fresh. It's going to keep it in place for a while. So, all you'll need to do is apply your paint. You'll usually want to do 2 coats. Seth is using a chalk paint here, in which case usually works with just 1 coat coverage. It's a pretty thick type of paint, and it's also water soluble, so it's a little bit more likely to come off clean, and it's a little easier to clean itself because it's chalk paint. What you might notice about this drawer, if you look at the sides of it, they're actually tin. Likely what this this piece was used for was actually as kitchen furniture, and we think that this was actually used as a proving drawer for bread and other leavened dough products,
Right.
biscuits, that kind of thing.
And one of the unique things about Hoosier cabinets is a lot of times they will have a drawer that has for grating flour that you will see with a turn grater, and so that's another unique thing about the Hoosier cabinet, is this shows a history. That's the unique thing about this piece, which is fun.
Yeah. So I think this looks pretty good. The thing to remember when you're painting, especially right now here, it's summer in the south, and the higher the humidity that's in the air, the higher our dew point is, the longer it's going to take for your paint to dry. So be patient with it. It might take a day or so to fully harden before you want to use that second coat, simply because if you start painting before it's completely dry, it's actually going to drag the wet areas and you'll have bald patches in the paint, and you don't want that. I think it looks good.
Yeah, it's looking good so far.
Sweet. There are a few additional things to take into consideration if you're planning to stain your piece of wood as opposed to painting it. Paint can be pretty quick to dry. It can be a little bit longer than normal with the humidity, but especially right now, stain is going to take exponentially longer to dry because it's so humid in the air right now. If you're going to stain, make sure that you're in a well-ventilated area like this one, or if you're staining in your garage, keep your garage door open. This is equally important when you use polyurethane, maybe even more so because it's a higher concentration of oil. With stain, everyone knows one of these little yellow cans. It's important when you start using your stain not to shake it. Make sure that you stir it, certainly, to mix it well. But if you shake it, you're incorporating more air into the stain, which leads to air bubbles. And when you apply your stain to the wood, any additional air bubbles that you have that are left on the wood at all as you're adding your stain are going to lead to imperfections in the coat. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. I tend to use foam brushes, primarily because it's a little bit easier to charge a foam brush and reload it with stain than it is to use a bristle brush. Foam also tends to accept less air into its pockets than a bristle brush does. Again, the less air, the less likely you are to have imperfections in your coat. Stain is something that you'll want to apply 2 to 3 coats of in order to really solidify and even out the layer that you have. Stain can be great because you can combine different colors and different layers. For example, what I have here is called red oak, but you could apply red oak for one coat and then early American for a second coat, which has a yellower texture to it or a yellower look. Combine those two together and you'll get different highlights on your wood. So if you're going to do that, or if you're not sure how the color is going to look in the first place, I would recommend finding maybe the inside of a door or the inside of a drawer. Try it out on that piece of wood first that isn't fully stained, isn't finished. See how it looks before you go. Once you've applied multiple coats of stain and you're ready to go, just make sure that you use your steel wool, your quadruple grade 0 steel wool. Rub down whatever you've stained. Use cheesecloth before you apply your first coat of polyurethane. Once you have your poly on that first coat, let it dry for a full day to 2 days, and then do the same thing again. Do the steel wool, do the cheesecloth, and then apply one more coat of this. Then you'll be ready to go. Let me get my hair out of my mouth.
Your hair straight, okay?
Okay.
Thanks for watching our program today.
If you have any questions for us, feel free to leave a comment below.
Please also tune in to some of our other programs Fridays at 7 p.m.
And don't forget to sign up for summer reading with us. Check out SpartanburgLibraries.org and request a summer reading card, or check it out at any one of your branches.